The Texas sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the Miller farm with a ferocity that seemed personal. It baked the dust into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, and on no one more than Clara, small for her 17 years, with a willowy frame that seemed better suited to needlepoint than to hauling water from the well. She moved with a practiced weariness. Her shoulders perpetually stooped under the weight of her chores and the heavier burden of her existence. Her dress, a faded calico worn thin as a prayer, was patched at the elbows and hemmed with a line of dark sweat. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and raw, the nails broken and permanently rimmed with dirt. Splinters were a constant, familiar pain. Today's task was mending the chicken coop, a job left to fester for weeks until her stepmother, Martha, had declared it Clara's responsibility, just as she declared everything unpleasant to be. From the shade of the porch, Martha watched, her face a mask of sour disapproval. She was a woman built of hard lines and harder opinions, who had married Clara's father after a fever took his first wife, Clara's mother, when he, too, had passed on a few years later, falling from a spooked horse. Martha's pretense of maternal affection had evaporated like morning dew in the noon sun. What remained was a cold, simmering resentment, directed entirely at the girl who was a living reminder of the woman her husband had truly loved. "Put your back into it, girl," Martha's voice cut through the shimmering heat, sharp and brittle. "That coop won't fix itself. Lord knows you're useless for much else." Beside her, Clara's two step-siblings, Abigail and Thomas, snickered. Abigail, a year older than Clara, fanned her flushed face with a lazy, entitled air. Thomas, 15, was whittling a piece of wood into a crude snake, casting mean-spirited glances at Clara as she struggled with a warped plank and a rusty hammer. They were their mother's children in every way, idle, cruel, and convinced of their own superiority over the waif in their midst. Clara didn't answer. She had learned long ago that silence was her only shield. Any word she spoke would be twisted, any defense seen as insolence. So she bit her lip, blinked the sweat from her eyes, and hammered the nail with a clumsy force that jarred her entire arm. The heat was suffocating, a physical presence that pressed in on her, making her head swim. She dreamed of water, of the cool, shaded creek that ran along the far edge of their property, a place where the willows wept and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. It was the only place she ever felt a sliver of peace. The Miller farm was just one pocket of misery in a town that offered Clara little comfort. When she accompanied Martha into the small settlement of dusty streets and clapboard buildings, she felt the weight of 100 scrutinizing eyes. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. They weren't about her threadbare dress or the perpetual sadness in her eyes. They were about her mother, a woman she barely remembered, a woman the town had branded with a quiet, unshakable judgment. "That's the Miller girl," she would hear them murmur behind their hands at the general store. "The one whose mother had flighty feet. Such a shame for her poor father. God rest his soul. Blood will tell, they say. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The insinuations were never direct, but they were clear. Her mother, they hinted, was not a woman of virtue. She was a woman who had come from somewhere else, with a laugh a little too loud and eyes a little too bright, and who had died too young for the town to ever truly accept her. The taint of that reputation had been passed down to Clara like a cursed inheritance. The other girls her age, the daughters of respectable ranchers and shopkeepers, kept their distance, their mothers having warned them away from the girl of questionable stock. They looked at Clara and saw not a lonely girl, but the ghost of a sinner. And so, Clara walked through the town as she walked through her life, alone, with her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Late that afternoon, after the coop was finally repaired to Martha's grudging satisfaction, Clara was sent to fetch a stray calf that had wandered toward the south pasture. The chore was a blessing. It took her near the creek, her secret sanctuary. She found the calf easily enough, its bell tinkling softly as it grazed, and began to lead it back. But as she neared the water, a flicker of movement in the shade of the willows caught her eye. It was a horse, a handsome bay gelding, standing with one leg held awkwardly off the ground. Its coat was dark with sweat, and its nostrils flared with pain and fear. There was no rider in sight. Clara's heart, so often guarded and bruised, went out to the creature, forgetting the calf, forgetting the time and the certainty of her stepmother's wrath. She tied the rope to a low-hanging branch and approached the horse with slow, careful steps, her voice a low, soothing murmur. "Easy now, boy, easy there. I'm not going to hurt you." The horse watched her with wide, intelligent eyes, its ears twitching. It flinched as she got closer, but didn't bolt. She saw the problem then. Its left foreleg was bleeding from a nasty gash just above the hoof, likely from a sharp rock in the creek bed. Without a second thought, Clara knelt and tore a long strip from the hem of her already ragged petticoat. She dipped the fabric in the cool creek water and began to gently, patiently, clean the wound. The horse trembled but stood still, seeming to understand the kindness of her touch. She was so absorbed in her task, whispering reassurances to the animal, that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind. "He threw a shoe and went lame on me." The voice was low and gravelly, startling her so much she nearly fell backward into the water. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. A man stood there, tall and lean, silhouetted against the setting sun. He was dressed in the worn denim and scuffed leather of a working cowboy, a dusty hat pulled low over his brow. He moved with a quiet economy, a stillness that seemed at odds with the vast, restless land around them. I'm sorry, sir," Clara stammered, twisting the wet rag in her hands. "I saw he was hurt. I was just trying to help." The man stepped out of the silhouette and into the softer light of the willow shade. Clara saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't handsome in the way the banker's son was. With his polished boots and easy smile, this man's face was all angles and shadows, weathered by sun and wind. He had a strong jaw darkened with a day's worth of stubble, and a mouth set in a serious, unsmiling line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky just before the rain, and they held a depth, a quiet intensity that made her feel he was looking right through her worn dress and into the very heart of her. He looked at the horse, then back at her, his gaze lingering on the strip of her petticoat she held in her trembling hands. "Luke," he said, his voice softer now. It wasn't a question, but an introduction. "Luke Callahan. Clara Miller. Not many folks would bother with a lame horse that wasn't theirs. Miss Miller," he said. The formal address felt strange and yet somehow respectful in a way she wasn't used to. "He was in pain," she said simply, as if it were the only explanation needed. Luke nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the scene, the gentle slope of the land, the Miller farmhouse stark on the horizon, and the dilapidated stretch of split-rail fence that marked the property line. "That fence line by the south pasture," he observed, his voice still low and even. "Looks like a strong wind could take it. I'm handy with repairs. Could fix it for you. No charge." The offer was so unexpected, so unthinkably kind, that Clara was struck dumb for a moment. No one offered her anything but commands and criticisms. The idea of a stranger offering his labor for free was a foreign concept, a part of her, a small, hopeful part she thought had long since died. Wanted to say yes, but the image of Martha's face, contorted with rage, flashed in her mind. A stranger on their land. A man, no less, talking to her. The consequences were unthinkable. "No," she said, the word coming out more choked than she intended. "Thank you, but no, my stepmother, she wouldn't take kindly to it. I have to go." She turned to untie the calf, her movements suddenly frantic. She needed to leave, To get away from this man and his unsettling eyes and his dangerous kindness before it could cause her any more trouble. "I understand," Luke said. There was no judgment in his tone, only a quiet resignation. She didn't dare look at him again, but she could feel his eyes on her as she hurried the calf up the path toward the house. It was a strange feeling. In his gaze, she hadn't felt judged or dismissed or tainted by her mother's reputation. For one brief, unnerving moment, she had simply felt seen. It was a connection as real and unspoken as the current of the creek flowing behind them, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two lonely souls under the vast Texas sky. By the time she reached the farmhouse, the last sliver of sun had disappeared, and the sky was bleeding into shades of purple and indigo. The lamps were lit inside, casting a warm, deceptive glow. The warmth, however, was only for show. As soon as she stepped through the door, the chill of Martha's fury met her. "The sun has been down for a good hour, Clara," Martha said, her voice deceptively calm. Abigail and Thomas were at the dinner table, their faces alight with malicious anticipation. "The calf strayed far," Clara began, her voice small. The slap came without warning, a crack of sound that echoed in the quiet room. Clara's head snapped to the side, and a fiery sting exploded across her cheek. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she forced them back, biting down hard on the inside of her lip. Crying only made it worse. "Do not lie to me, you worthless girl," Martha hissed, her face inches from Clara's. "You are my burden, a constant reminder of your father's foolishness and your mother's shame. You live under my roof, you eat my food, and you will do as you are told. When I tell you to be back by sundown, you will be back. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara whispered, her cheek throbbing. "Go to your room. There will be no supper for you tonight. Perhaps an empty belly will help you remember your place." Clara fled without another word, escaping up the narrow stairs to her small attic room. She didn't light a lamp. She didn't need to. She knew the placement of every piece of meager furniture, the slope of the ceiling, the single small window that looked out over the dark fields. She didn't go to bed. Instead, she slipped out onto the small, flat part of the porch roof outside her window, a place no one else knew about. She sat there for hours, her arms wrapped around her knees, the cool night air a balm on her burning cheek. The world was vast and silent, the sky a spill of diamond-bright stars. In these moments, alone with the heavens, the farm and its cruel inhabitants felt small and distant. She thought of her father, trying to conjure the memory of his warm laugh and the safe feeling of his strong arms. He had promised he would always look after her, but the stars were cold and far away, and he was gone. A tear she had refused to shed in front of Martha finally traced a hot path through the dust on her cheek. She let it fall. Then another. She cried silently for her father, for her lost mother, for the girl who worked her fingers to the bone only to be met with a blow and a sneer. But as she sat there, staring up at the indifferent constellations, another image pushed its way into her thoughts. For the first time in a long, long time, the face she pictured was not her father's. It was the face of a stranger, a quiet cowboy with eyes the color of a stormy sky, who had offered to mend a broken fence for nothing at all. And in the crushing darkness of her world, that small, inexplicable kindness felt as bright and as distant as any star. The following day rose with the same oppressive heat, but something in the air felt different to Clara. The memory of the stranger's eyes and the dull, persistent throb in her cheek were two opposing forces pulling at her. One was a familiar pain, the other a new and unsettling hope. She went about her morning chores with a distracted air, her gaze drifting repeatedly to the south pasture and the broken fence line. She half expected, half feared, to see him there, but the horizon remained empty. Luke Callahan did not ride to the fence. He rode into town. He told himself it was to see the blacksmith about his horse's shoe, a plausible and necessary errand. But the lie was thin even to himself. The truth was a magnet, pulling him toward the place he knew Clara had to be. He was a man accustomed to solitude, who found more comfort in the silent company of his horse than in the hollow chatter of townsfolk. Yet the image of the girl by the creek, her gentle hands, her fearful eyes, had followed him through a sleepless night. He felt a disquiet he couldn't name, a protective instinct that was as foreign to him as it was powerful. He was tying his horse to the hitching post outside the blacksmith's when he saw her. She was walking a few paces behind her stepmother, heading toward Henderson's general store. Clara carried an empty basket, her head bowed, her steps small and subservient. Martha strode ahead, a ramrod of righteous purpose. Luke's jaw tightened. He watched them disappear inside. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he abandoned his errand and followed, keeping to the shadows of the wooden boardwalk. He stopped just inside the doorway, shielded by a tall stack of burlap sacks that smelled of coffee beans and dust. The store was a cluttered universe of goods, barrels of pickles and crackers, bolts of calico and denim, shelves stacked high with canned peaches, tools, and patent medicines. A few other customers milled about, a rancher's wife, 2 farmhands, and Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious gossip. "A bag of flour, Mr. Henderson," Martha announced, her voice ringing with authority. "And see that it's fresh. The last one was riddled with weevils." She turned to Clara. "Go on, girl, fetch it. And for heaven's sake, try not to drop it this time. You're as clumsy as a newborn colt." Clara scurried to the back of the store, her face burning with humiliation. She hoisted the heavy sack into her arms, staggering slightly under the weight. As she turned, her elbow brushed against a precarious pyramid of tinned tomatoes. One can wobbled, then crashed to the floor, rolling noisily under a shelf. The sound was like a gunshot in the suddenly silent store. Every eye turned to Clara. Martha's face went rigid with fury. "You see," she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Useless, utterly and completely useless. I give you a roof over your head, food in your belly, and this is the gratitude I receive. You shame the memory of your father with your incompetence." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot and stinging. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was an accident." "An accident," Martha mimicked with cruel sarcasm. "Everything with you is an accident. Your very existence feels like an accident some days." From his hiding place, Luke felt a cold, hard rage settle in his gut. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He saw the faint, purplish shadow on Clara's cheek, the ghost of last night's blow, now starkly visible in the store's dusty light. He saw the other customers looking on, some with pity, most with a detached, mildly entertained curiosity. No one stepped forward. No one spoke a word in her defense. They were all complicit in her degradation. He understood then that her cage was not just the farm, but the entire town. His instinct was to stride forward, to put himself between the girl and her tormentor. But he held himself back. He knew that any action on his part would only bring a worse fury down on her head later. In private, he was a stranger, an outsider with a name that carried its own whispers. His interference would be a curse, not a kindness. So he stood as still as a statue, his stormy eyes burning, and watched as Clara, trembling, paid for the flour and followed her stepmother out of the store, a walking embodiment of shame. After they were gone, and the store's patrons had resumed their murmuring, Luke stepped out from behind the sacks. He walked to the counter where a display of ribbons and scarves lay. Without a word, he pointed to a simple neckerchief of soft spun cotton. It was the color of wild violets, of a twilight sky, a small, defiant splash of beauty in a world of brown dust and faded calico. "Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "A gift for a lady, Mr. Callahan?" Luke didn't answer. He simply laid the coins on the counter, took the small, paper-wrapped parcel, and walked out. He didn't ride directly back to his small, isolated line shack. He took the long way, circling around to the back of the Miller property. He dismounted near the dilapidated barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. He knew this was where she did most of her work, where she would be sent to muck out the stalls or feed the livestock. On a weathered fence post near the barn door, the very fence he had offered to fix. He carefully placed the parcel. It was a silent, anonymous offering, a gesture that could be denied if discovered, a secret message meant only for her. Then he swung back onto his horse and disappeared as quietly as he had come. Clara found it an hour later. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, fell upon the small package. Her first thought was that it was a mistake, something a farmhand had forgotten. But there were no farmhands, only her and her stepfamily. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. It was addressed to no one. She glanced around nervously, then ducked into the shadowy interior of the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. She unwrapped the paper. The color took her breath away. It was beautiful, so exquisitely purple, so soft to the touch. Nothing in her life had ever been so vibrant or so new. She pressed it to her cheek, the coolness of the cotton a comfort against her still tender skin. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. With a certainty that settled deep in her soul, she knew who had left it. The cowboy. The man with the storm-gray eyes. It was an impossible, dangerous, wonderful thought. It was a secret she hugged to herself. A tiny flame of warmth cupped in her hands against a cold wind. She tucked the scarf into the pocket of her dress, a hidden treasure that was hers and hers alone. The scarf was a beginning. A few days later, while she was out checking the water trough, he was there, riding the fence line. He didn't ride onto Miller land, but stayed on the other side, as if by chance. "Afternoon, Miss Miller," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her voice shy, her hand instinctively going to her pocket where the scarf was safely tucked. They talked for only a few minutes, about the lack of rain and the price of cattle. The conversation was mundane, but the space between the words was filled with a powerful, unspoken current. These meetings became their ritual, stolen moments by the fence, under the guise of chores and happenstance. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. He learned of the never-ending labor, the constant criticism, the profound loneliness of her life. She learned that he worked for the Big Cross Sea Ranch to the west, that he kept to himself, and that his silence was not one of coldness, but of a deep, abiding caution. One late afternoon, as the sun bled orange and pink across the plains, Clara found herself confiding in him in a way she never had with anyone. "I dream of leaving this place," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Sometimes I lie awake and I imagine what it would be like to see the ocean, or the mountains in Colorado they talk about, just to go somewhere where nobody knows my name, or my mother's name, somewhere I could just be me." Luke listened, his expression unreadable. "But it's just a fool's dream," she finished with a sigh, her shoulders slumping. "There's no money, no way to get there, and no one in this world to trust." She looked at him then, her eyes full of a desperate vulnerability, as if testing to see if he, too, would dismiss her. He didn't. He just nodded slowly. "A person needs someone to trust," was all he said, but the way he said it made her feel he understood completely. Their bond, forged in these brief encounters, deepened into something that felt vital as air. One night, a full moon hung in the sky, so bright it washed the landscape in silver. Clara had slipped out to the creek, unable to bear the suffocating confines of the house. She found Luke already there, sitting on a fallen log, seemingly waiting for her. He had a way of knowing where she would be. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the chorus of crickets and the gentle murmur of the water. The moonlight was honest, stripping away the pretenses of the day. "You told me you had no one to trust," Luke said finally, his voice quiet in the vast night. "There's a reason for that. Folks'll turn on you for things that ain't your fault." Clara waited, sensing this was different from their other talks. "My name isn't just my name," he went on, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "It's his name, too, my father's." He took a breath. "He robbed a bank over in the Panhandle, killed a teller who went for his gun. They hanged him in the town square when I was 12. Made the whole town watch." Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The whispers about Luke's past suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "He wasn't a bad man, not all the way through," Luke continued, his voice flat, as if reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "He just got tangled up in something he couldn't get out of. But that don't matter to folks. All they see is the rope. The name Callahan, around here, means thief and killer." He paused, and when he spoke again, a new layer of pain was in his voice. "My mother, she couldn't bear the shame, the way people looked at her, at me, a week after the hanging. She packed a small bag, told me to be a good boy, and got on an eastbound stagecoach. Never looked back, never sent a word." Clara's heart ached for the 12-year-old boy left alone with the ghost of a hanged father and the memory of a mother who had walked away. His shame, his solitude, his profound mistrust of the world, it all fell into place. He was branded, just as she was. His wound was from a rope and a stagecoach. Hers was from a cruel stepmother and the town's poisonous gossip. But they were both wounds of abandonment, of being judged for the sins of their parents. She moved her hand, her fingers gently brushing against his on the rough bark of the log. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of recognition, of profound, shared understanding. He didn't pull away. In the silvery light of the moon, they looked at each other, and the last of the fences between them seemed to dissolve. They were no longer just a lonely girl and a quiet cowboy. They were two survivors, two halves of a whole hurt, who had found in each other a place of refuge. They saw their own pain reflected in the other's eyes, and in that shared reflection, they felt the first, fragile glimmer of a hope that they might, together, be able to heal. The fragile peace Clara and Luke had built in their stolen moments by the fence was not meant to last. A secret in a town as small as theirs was like a lit candle in a dark room. It could not help but draw eyes. Their quiet meetings, shielded by the willows in the fading light of day, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Glances that had once been merely suspicious now hardened with certainty whenever Clara was in town. The whispers intensified, coiling around her like smoke. "There she is, Mrs." Gable would murmur to a neighbor over a barrel of dried beans. "And have you seen the Callahan boy lately? He looks at her, you know the look, like a wolf sizing up a stray lamb." "Like calls to like, I suppose," the neighbor would reply, shaking her head with grim satisfaction. "His father's bad blood, her mother's loose ways. It's a tragedy waiting to happen." Luke felt it, too. When he went to the saloon for a rare drink, conversations would halt, the air growing thick with unspoken accusations. The other cowboys, men he worked with every day, would watch him from the corners of their eyes. He was the son of a killer, a man permanently marked by a past that was not his own. By associating with Clara, a girl already deemed tainted, he was simply confirming what they had all suspected, that he was no good, and drawn to that which was equally broken. The poison of this gossip eventually found its way to the Miller farm. It was Thomas who delivered the final, fatal blow. He had been sent to find a missing shovel and, in a rare moment of actual effort, had wandered near the south pasture. From a distance, he saw them, Clara on their side of the fence, Luke on the other. He saw the quiet intensity of their conversation, the way Clara's face, usually so guarded and sad, softened when she looked at the cowboy. He watched for a long time, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, then crept back to the house, the shovel forgotten, a far more potent tool of malice now in his possession. That night, the storm broke. Clara was in the kitchen, scrubbing the last of the supper pots. When Martha entered, the room was hot and close, smelling of grease and boiled cabbage. Martha didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her silence was more menacing than any shout. She simply stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed into chips of cold, blue stone. "You think I am a fool," she stated, her voice a low, venomous hiss. Clara's blood ran cold. She kept scrubbing, her knuckles white. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Martha took a step closer. "My son tells me you've been entertaining a visitor by the south fence. A man with a name that decent folk don't speak in polite company. The son of a murderer. You have been meeting with Luke Callahan." It was not a question. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. To deny it would be useless. To admit it, catastrophic. She said nothing, her silence a confession in itself. "You bring shame on this house," Martha continued, her voice trembling with a righteous fury that was far more terrifying than her usual spite. "First your mother, with her city ways and her wandering eyes, and now you, consorting with gallows trash. You will not do it. You will not drag your father's name, my name, further into the mud." He's been kind to me," Clara whispered, a pathetic, desperate defense. The word kind seemed to enrage Martha further. "Kind?" she spat. "Men like that are not kind. They are predators. They see a weak, foolish thing like you and they take what they want, and when they're done, they leave you ruined. Do you think I will have a ruined girl under my roof?" Martha paced the small kitchen like a caged animal. "I have been patient with you, Clara. I have honored your father's memory by keeping you, feeding you, clothing you. But my patience has its limits. This ends now." She stopped and leaned in close, her breath sour. "I know a man in the next county, Jebediah Stone, the blacksmith. A hard man, but a God-fearing one. His wife died of the fever last spring, and he needs help in his house, a strong girl to cook and clean and mind his children. He's willing to pay for a good, long contract, an indenture." The name fell into the room like a block of ice. Everyone knew of Jebediah Stone. He was a mountain of a man with fists like hammers, known for breaking horses and spirits with equal, methodical cruelty. It was said his first wife had simply wasted away from misery, and that a young servant girl he'd hired last year had run off into the desert, choosing to face the coyotes rather than another day in his home. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. This was not a threat of a beating. This was a threat of erasure, of being sold into a life that was little more than slavery, a living death from which there would be no escape. "You will never speak to that trash again," Martha decreed, her voice a deathly whisper. "You will not look at him. You will not walk near him. You will not even think his name. If I see him anywhere on this property, if I hear so much as a whisper that you've been seen together, you will be packing your one dress and leaving for Mr. Stone's forge before the sun is up. Am I understood?" Clara could only nod, a wave of nausea and terror washing over her. The small, secret flame of hope she had nurtured was being systematically, brutally extinguished. The next afternoon, she went to the fence. She had to. She couldn't just disappear. She owed him that much. When he rode up, the easy smile he reserved only for her died on his lips the moment he saw her face. It was a pale, tear-streaked mask of misery. "Clara, what is it? What's wrong?" he asked, dismounting and coming to the fence. She couldn't meet his eyes. She stared at a splintered fence post, her hands clenched at her sides. "Luke, we can't see each other anymore." The words felt like shards of glass in her throat. He was silent for a moment. "What are you talking about? Is this because of the town? We knew they'd talk. I thought we agreed it didn't matter." "It does matter," she lied, the untruth bitter on her tongue. "It matters. People are saying things about me, about you. It's not right. It has to stop." She was pleading, praying he would just accept it, that he wouldn't fight, wouldn't make this any harder than it already was. But Luke was not a man for subtleties. He saw past the lie to the fear behind it. "This is your stepmother," he said, his voice hardening. "This is her doing. What did she say to you, Clara? Tell me." "She didn't say anything," Clara cried, finally looking at him, her eyes wild with a panic he mistook for rejection. "This is my choice. Please, Luke, just go away and don't come back. Please." His face, which had been filled with concern, now closed off, becoming a stony mask of hurt and anger. He felt as if she had struck him, after he had shared the deepest wound of his past, after he had believed they had found a common ground. She was casting him aside because of whispers. "Fine," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "If that's what you want." He turned without another glance, swung himself onto his horse, and rode away, the stiff line of his back a testament to his wounded pride. Clara watched him go until he was just a speck in the distance. Then she sank to the ground, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. Luke rode for hours, a black rage churning in his gut. The more he replayed their conversation, the less he believed it. Her fear had been too real, too raw. It wasn't the fear of gossip. It was the fear of something much worse. It was Martha. He knew it as surely as he knew the sun would rise, and the thought of that woman tormenting Clara, twisting their connection into something ugly and using it to hurt her, was more than he could bear. The anger simmering inside him boiled over. He was done sneaking. He was done being cautious. He turned his horse and rode hard for the Miller farm. He arrived in a cloud of dust. Pulling his horse to a halt directly in front of the porch, he swung down before the animal had even stopped moving. Martha was there, shelling peas in a rocking chair, a look of triumph on her face. She had been expecting him. "Get off my land, Callahan," she said calmly. "What did you do to her?" Luke demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He ignored the command, stepping onto the porch. "What did you threaten her with?" Martha's composure broke. She stood up, letting the bowl of peas crash to the floor. Her face became a mask of theatrical outrage. "Get away from me!" she shrieked, her voice suddenly loud enough to carry, "Get off my property, you thief! We've seen you skulking around for weeks!" At her cry, the front door flew open and Thomas and Abigail appeared, their faces perfectly schooled in fear and accusation. "Ma, is that him?" Thomas shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Luke. "He's the one I saw, near the tool shed last night, trying to steal Pa's old saddle." "Thief!" Abigail screamed, clutching her mother's arm. Luke stood frozen, caught in the web of their lies. He looked from one venomous face to the next and saw the trap closing around him. He was a Callahan. In this town, that name alone was half a conviction. To fight, to deny, would be useless. It would be his word against the word of a grieving widow and her 2 children. He knew who the sheriff would believe. A bitter, corrosive despair washed through him. He was powerless. Any move he made would only tighten the noose, not just for him, but for Clara. He took a step back, his hands unclenched from the fists they had become. He looked past Thomas and Abigail, his eyes searching the dark windows of the house, hoping for a glimpse of her. Then he looked directly at Martha. The rage in his eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, and far more resolute. It was a look of pure, unyielding determination, a silent promise that this was not over. He held her gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills waged on the sun-bleached porch, and he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes before she masked it with a sneer. Without another word, Luke turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving the chorus of false accusations to fade behind him. He rode with his back straight, his face a granite mask of bitterness. But in his heart, a decision had been forged in the fire of his anger. They could call him a thief, they could call him a killer's son, but he would not let them destroy the one good thing he had found in this world. He would not abandon her. Upstairs, hidden behind a lace curtain. Clara had watched the entire scene unfold. She had seen Luke's fury, heard her stepmother's lies, and felt a fresh wave of despair so profound it left her breathless. Her plan to protect him had failed. She had not only broken his heart, she had led him into a trap and allowed him to be branded a criminal. When the dust from his horse had settled, she fled from the window, from the house, from the suffocating presence of her family. She ran to the barn, the only place she felt she could breathe. The familiar scent of hay and dust filled her lungs. In the dim light, she stumbled toward an empty stall and sank into the hay, her body shaking. Her hand went to her pocket and pulled out the purple scarf. It was no longer vibrant, its color slightly faded from her constant, secret touch. It smelled of soap from her hands, of hay from the barn, and now, of the salt from the fresh tears that fell onto the soft cotton. She clutched it to her chest, the flimsy piece of fabric the only tangible evidence of the beautiful, impossible thing she had been forced to kill. And there, alone in the shadows, she finally wept, her sobs the only sound in the vast, cruel silence of the afternoon. The weeks that followed Luke's departure bled into a miserable, gray autumn. The vibrant colors of their secret meetings faded, replaced by the stark, skeletal branches of the cottonwoods and a sky the color of old pewter. Clara moved through her days like a phantom, her heart a hollow ache in her chest. The purple scarf, once a symbol of hope, was now a relic of a buried dream, hidden away at the bottom of her small trunk. She did her work, endured Martha's sharpened cruelty, and spoke to no one, retreating into a silence so profound it was like a wall of ice around her. Then the first blue norther swept down from the plains, and winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. It came with a wind that had teeth, stripping the last stubborn leaves from the trees and turning the hard-packed earth to iron. The cold was a physical entity, a relentless predator that found every crack in the farmhouse walls, every thin spot in Clara's worn dress. Her chores became instruments of torture. Hauling water from the well left her hands numb and cracked, the icy handle of the bucket searing her skin, mucking out the stalls, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She felt the damp cold seep deep into her bones, a chill that no amount of work could warm. Martha showed no pity. Clara's suffering was merely an inconvenience. "Faster, girl!" she would snap as Clara struggled with a frozen pump handle. "The livestock won't wait on your shivering." The relentless labor and the biting cold took their inevitable toll. It began with a shiver she couldn't shake, a deep weariness that settled in her limbs. Then came the fever. One morning, she tried to get out of bed and the floor tilted violently, her body a battlefield of fire and ice. A racking cough tore at her lungs, leaving her weak and breathless. She was confined to her small attic room, a place that had become a prison of ice. The wind howled through the eaves, and a thin layer of frost grew in crystalline patterns on the inside of her window pane. She lay on her narrow cot, buried under a single, threadbare blanket, her teeth chattering with a deep, uncontrollable chill even as her skin burned with fever. Martha brought her a bowl of thin broth once a day, leaving it on the floor with an air of profound annoyance, as if Clara had chosen to become ill purely to spite her. For days, Clara drifted in a terrifying limbo between waking and nightmare. The world dissolved into a swirl of distorted memories and feverish hallucinations. She was back at the creek, but the water was frozen solid. She was in the general store, but the shelves were stocked with accusing eyes, and through it all, one name, one face, was a constant, desperate refrain. "Luke," she would whisper to the empty, freezing room, her voice a dry rasp. "The fence is broken. It's so cold. Luke." Abigail, sent upstairs to fetch a box of old linens, heard the name through the thin wooden door. She paused, listened to the feverish, nonsensical murmurs, and a cruel, knowing smile touched her lips. She tiptoed back downstairs, eager to report this new, scandalous detail to her mother. Clara was not only useless and sick, she was dreaming of the town pariah. Luke had not left. He had moved his camp to a remote, wooded hollow on the edge of the Cross Sea Ranch, a place that gave him a clear, distant view of the Miller farm. He was a patient man, a hunter by nature, and he watched the farm with a hunter's intensity. He had been waiting, biding his time, unsure of his next move but certain he could not abandon her. He saw the doctor's buggy make a single, brief visit and then not return. He saw Clara disappear from her outdoor chores. He saw that at night. No lamp ever burned in her small attic window, and no smoke ever curled from the chimney pipe that served her room. He knew, with a cold certainty that gripped his heart, that she was sick and alone in the cold and the dark. The knowledge gnawed at him, overriding the caution that had governed his entire life. To be caught on Millerland now, after Martha's accusations, would be a death sentence. They would call him a trespasser, a thief, and worse. A gunshot in the night would be explained away easily as a farmer defending his property. He knew the risk, and he knew he had to take it. One moonless, starless night, when the cold was so sharp it felt like breathing glass, he made his move. He left his horse tied deep in the woods and approached the farm on foot, moving through the darkness with a ghostly silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a frozen leaf, sounded like a cannon shot in the still air. He carried a small, heavy bundle, a bottle of Dr. Abernathy's fever tincture, purchased for a steep price in a town 20 miles away where no one knew his name, and a small but dense sack of high-grade charcoal. He reached the house, a dark, sleeping monolith against the sky. The porch groaned under his weight as he climbed onto its roof, the same place Clara sought refuge. He crept to her window. It was dark, just as he'd feared. He couldn't risk opening it, couldn't risk a sound. He gently placed the bundle on the sill, where she would see it if she had the strength to look. It was a desperate, inadequate gesture, a prayer sent into the darkness. He stayed for a moment, a silent guardian on the roof, his hand resting on the icy glass, before melting back into the night. The next morning, a sliver of weak sunlight pierced the grime on Clara's window. In a moment of lucidity, she dragged herself from the cot, desperate for a drink of the icy water in her pitcher. It was then she saw the bundle. For a moment, she thought it was another fever dream, but it was real. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the string. Inside, the bottle of dark liquid and the small sack of black lumps seemed like a miracle. There was no note, but none was needed. Only one person in the world would do this. Luke. He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't abandoned her. The knowledge was a medicine more powerful than any tincture, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She fed a few lumps of the charcoal into her tiny, rusted brazier, lit them with a shaking hand, and swallowed a spoonful of the bitter medicine before collapsing back into bed, a single, grateful tear tracing a path on her fevered cheek. Clara's fever broke a few days later. The medicine and the small, precious source of heat had pulled her back from the brink. She was still terribly weak, a pale shadow of her former self. But she was alive. As she slowly regained her strength, she became aware of a new tension in the house. Martha was often gone for long periods, returning with a look of grim satisfaction. Abigail preened and simpered, casting looks at Clara that were a mixture of pity and smug triumph. Luke heard the news in the last place he wanted to be, the town saloon. He had come in for supplies, and the talk was unavoidable. "You hear about Martha Miller?" one rancher said to another over mugs of beer. "Finally managed to unload that girl of hers, betrothed her to Silas Croft, over in Willow Creek." The name landed on Luke like a physical blow. Silas Croft was a name known and feared throughout the territory. He was a merchant of immense wealth and immense appetites. A fat, wheezing man in his late 60s who had already buried 2 young wives. Rumor had it they had died not of illness, but of sheer, grinding misery. Croft was known to be a man who bought what he wanted, and he wanted a new, young wife, one who was pretty, poor, and powerless enough not to give him any trouble. Made a good deal for herself. Martha did. The other man chuckled. Croft's forgiving a substantial debt she owes him at his mercantile. Gets the girl off her hands and her books in the black. Smart woman. Luke didn't hear any more. A white-hot rage, pure and blinding, washed over him. This wasn't a marriage. This was a sale. Martha was selling Clara like a head of cattle to a rich, cruel old man to settle a debt. The promise of Jebediah Stone's forge had been replaced by the gilded cage of Silas Croft's house. But it was a death sentence all the same. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the quiet dignity he had seen in Clara, all of it was to be snuffed out, sacrificed on the altar of Martha's greed. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his movements stiff and deliberate. There was no more waiting. There was no more watching from a distance. The time for caution was over. He went to the livery, saddled his horse, and checked the weight of the colt at his hip. As night fell, he wasn't riding toward his lonely camp. He was riding toward town. A man propelled by a singular, desperate purpose. He would not let her be sold. The next day was the day of the winter market fair, a yearly event that drew people from all the surrounding ranches. The main street was a chaos of noise and color. There were stalls selling pies and preserves, livestock pens filled with bellowing cattle, and crowds of people bundled in their thickest coats. It was into this swirling mass of humanity that Luke rode, his eyes scanning the crowd, his face grim. He saw them near the courthouse steps. Martha stood talking to a portly, overdressed man with a face like a spoiled pig. It had to be Croft. He had a proprietary hand on Clara's arm. And Clara, she looked like a ghost. She was pale and thin, lost inside a heavy wool shawl that was clearly a cast-off of Martha's. Her eyes were vacant, fixed on some distant point, her expression one of utter, deadened resignation. She was there, but she was already gone. Luke dismounted, leaving his horse's reins to trail on the ground. He moved through the crowd not with a push, but with an intensity that made people instinctively step aside. He didn't see the vendors, didn't hear the laughter or the haggling. He saw only her. He reached her side just as Croft let out a wet, wheezing laugh. Martha was smiling, a predator's smile. Neither of them noticed him at first, but Clara did. She felt a presence, a sudden shift in the air, and her vacant eyes flickered toward him. For the first time all day, a spark of life returned to their depths. Luke didn't speak to Martha. He didn't acknowledge Croft. He looked only at Clara. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but it was warm, and the contact was like a jolt of lightning, snapping her out of her trance. Her fingers instinctively curled around his. He leaned in close, his voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the noise of the fair, a sound meant only for her. "If you agree," he said, his stormy eyes holding hers, his grip on her hand firm and certain, "we'll ride far away from this place." The world around Clara seemed to fall away. The noise of the crowd, the cold wind on her face, the heavy weight of Silas Croft's gaze. It all vanished. There was only Luke's voice, Luke's hand in hers, and his incredible, impossible offer. A lifeline, an escape, a choice, her choice. For a single, silent beat of a heart, the world stood still. There was only Luke's question hanging in the cold air and the desperate, dawning hope in Clara's eyes. Behind her, she could hear her stepmother's gasp of outrage, the beginning of a furious tirade. Silas Croft's piggy eyes narrowed in displeasure, but their world no longer existed. In that moment, Clara saw the two paths of her life laid bare before her. One, a slow, gilded death in the house of a cruel old man. The other, an unknown, perilous flight into the wilderness with the only person who had ever seen her as more than a burden. It wasn't a choice. It was a salvation. "Yes," she breathed. The word a prayer, A vow. The world exploded back into motion. Luke didn't wait for another word. He pulled her with him, his grip firm and protective. Martha shrieked, a sound of pure fury. "Stop him! That's my stepdaughter! He's kidnapping her! Sheriff!" Croft bellowed, his face turning a mottled purple. "Thief! Abducting my intended!" But Luke moved with the speed and purpose of a striking hawk. He reached his horse, lifted Clara onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, and swung up behind her in a single, fluid motion. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her tight against his chest, and seized the reins with his other hand. With a sharp kick, the powerful horse lunged forward, scattering startled onlookers. They galloped down the main street, the shouts and accusations fading behind them into the chaotic noise of the fair. Clara clung to him, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat, the pounding of his heart a steady, reassuring rhythm against her ear. The town flew by in a blur of stunned faces and clabbered buildings. Then they were clear, racing out onto the open plains, the cold wind whipping her hair and tearing at her thin dress. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the faded purple scarf tied around her neck, a scarf that had been a secret promise and was now the banner of her liberation. They rode hard for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life they were leaving behind. The gray, overcast sky grew darker, the clouds boiling with a bruised, heavy light. A cold wind began to howl, and then the first drops of rain fell, hard and stinging like pellets of ice. Soon, it became a downpour, a relentless, driving sheet of water that soaked them to the bone in minutes, and turned the world into a churning, gray misery. The storm was a fury, but it was also a blessing, washing away their tracks, erasing them from the landscape. Clara began to shiver, a deep, racking tremor that shook her entire frame. The cold was a living thing, sinking its teeth into her, and the weakness from her recent fever returned with a vengeance. Luke felt her trembling and pulled her closer, trying to shield her with his body, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was a wall of warmth and strength against the storm. "Just a little longer," he shouted over the roar of the wind and rain. "I know a place." He guided the horse off the open plain and into the relative shelter of a dense pine forest. The air here was thick with the scent of wet earth and resin, the sound of the rain a dull roar on the canopy above. Deeper and deeper they went, until Luke finally pulled the horse to a halt in a small clearing. Before them stood a dark, dilapidated shape, an old hunter's cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, its roof sagging but mostly intact. It was a forgotten, derelict place, but to them, it was a palace. Luke dismounted and gently lifted her down, her legs so weak and numb she could barely stand. He led her onto the small, covered porch while he quickly unsaddled the weary horse, rubbing it down as best he could before tying it under the thickest pines. Then he turned his attention to the cabin. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a single, dark room that smelled of old smoke, dust, and mice. It was small, empty save for a stone fireplace and a rickety wooden cot frame, but it was dry. It was shelter. While Clara huddled on the porch, her teeth chattering, Luke moved with a swift efficiency that spoke of a life lived in hard places. He found a small stack of dry wood left behind under the cot, supplemented it with deadfall from near the cabin, and soon had a small, struggling fire crackling to life in the stone hearth. The first tongues of flame were the most beautiful things Clara had ever seen. He led her inside, seating her on the floor before the nascent fire. The light flickered across her pale face, illuminating the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. She was shivering so violently now that her whole body seemed to vibrate. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. Luke watched her for a moment, his expression grim. Then, without a word, he shrugged off his heavy, sheepskin-lined coat. The outer leather was damp, but the thick wool lining was still warm and dry. He knelt behind her and draped it over her shoulders. The effect was immediate. The coat's weight was a comfort, a solid, grounding presence. Its warmth began to seep into her, a slow, life-giving tide pushing back the cold. And the scent of it, leather, wood smoke, horse, and the clean, masculine scent of Luke himself, enveloped her, a scent of safety and strength. She leaned back into it, a small sigh of relief escaping her lips. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the drumming of the rain on the roof and the hiss and crackle of the fire. The flames grew stronger, pushing the shadows back into the corners of the room, painting the rough log walls in dancing shades of orange and gold. The world had been reduced to this small, warm circle of light, a sanctuary against the storm outside and the storm they had escaped. As the warmth returned to her limbs, Clara slowly uncurled. They sat side by side, their shoulders nearly touching. She held her hands out to the fire, and he did the same. In the space between them, their little fingers brushed. It was an accident, a fleeting contact, but it sent a jolt through Clara. A moment later, Luke moved his hand deliberately, covering hers with his own. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the fire, his hand covering hers. A silent question. She answered by slowly, hesitantly, lacing her fingers with his. His hand tightened, a firm, reassuring grip. In the safety of that small cabin, with the fire warming her skin and his hand holding hers, Clara felt the last of her defenses begin to crumble. He had risked everything for her. He had accepted her without question. He deserved the entire truth, including the part of her that was so broken and shamed she had never spoken of it to another soul. "Luke," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the sound of the fire. He turned to look at her, his stormy eyes dark and serious in the flickering light. "There's something you should know," she continued, her gaze falling to their joined hands. "A reason why my stepmother always said I was spoiled goods. Why Mr. Croft would have me." Her breath hitched. "It wasn't just my mother's reputation. It was me." She finally found the courage to look at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I have nothing pure left to give you, Luke. When I was younger, after my father died, there was a farmhand. He cornered me in the barn one day. Martha found out. She dismissed him, but not to protect me. She used it. It was her secret weapon, the thing she could hold over me forever to prove that I was worthless, that I was ruined." She pulled her hand from his, wrapping her arms around herself again, a reflexive gesture of shame and protection. "So, you see," she finished, her voice breaking, "I am not whole. There's a part of me that is broken and dirty, and I can never get it back." She turned her face away, unable to bear the look of pity or disgust she was sure she would see in his eyes. She waited for him to pull away, to stand up, to regret the choice he had made. But he didn't move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, a bedrock in her swirling sea of shame. "Clara, look at me." Reluctantly, she turned her head. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His eyes held no pity, no disgust. They held a deep, unwavering tenderness that took her breath away. He looked at her for a long time, as if he were memorizing her face, seeing past the pain and into the very heart of her. "I don't need perfection," he said softly, his voice resonating with a conviction that sank deep into her soul. "I need you, just as you are." He leaned a little closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "That hurt, what that man did to you, that's his filth, not yours. It's a scar he left on you, but you are not the scar. You are the person who survived it. That's who I see." Her breath caught in a sob, a sound of profound, shattering relief. He wasn't just accepting her past, he was giving it back to her, cleansed of its shame. He lifted his hand to cup her jaw, his touch gentle but firm. He leaned in, and the world narrowed to the space between them. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, giving her a final chance to turn away. She didn't. She leaned into his touch. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, reverent coming together. It was hesitant, trembling, soft as moth wings. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and the salt of her tears. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. Then, as she responded, a lifetime of unspoken longing, of desperate, lonely nights and secret, fragile hopes poured into it. It deepened, becoming a fierce, passionate claiming. A kiss that spoke of survival and sanctuary and the profound, terrifying beauty of being truly seen and accepted, brokenness and all. In the warm, flickering light of that fire, with the storm raging outside, they came together. It was not an act of frantic passion, but a slow, tender exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and unseen. For Clara, it was a reclamation of a body she had felt was no longer her own, a discovery of a pleasure and a closeness she had never imagined. For Luke, it was the end of a lifetime of solitude, a final lowering of the walls he had built around his heart. It was an act born of desperation and trust, of shared pain and a fierce, defiant hope. Two souls, long adrift in their own lonely wildernesses, had finally found their way home to each other. The world was born anew in the gray light of dawn. The rain had stopped, and the only sound was the gentle dripping of water from the pine boughs and the soft sigh of the dying embers in the hearth. Clara woke slowly, cocooned in the heavy warmth of Luke's coat, her head pillowed on his shoulder. For the first time in her memory, she had not woken to the shrill call of her stepmother or the immediate, crushing weight of her chores. She had woken to a sense of peace so profound it felt like a dream. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell, listening to the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. The night had been a revelation, a tender, healing balm on the deepest wounds of her soul. In the darkness of the cabin, she had not been the spoiled, worthless thing Martha had always called her. She had been cherished. She had been desired. She had been, simply, Clara. Luke stirred, his arm tightening around her, and his eyes opened. In the soft morning light, the storminess was gone, replaced by a quiet, unguarded tenderness that made her heart ache with a new and beautiful emotion. He didn't speak, just looked at her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if seeing her for the first time. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Morning," she whispered back, a small, shy smile touching her lips. A comfortable silence settled between them, a language of shared glances and quiet understanding. But the world outside the cabin, the world they had fled, still existed. They both knew they couldn't stay. "There's a town," Luke said finally, breaking the silence as he sat up, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. "West of here, a few days' ride, called Willow Creek. It's not much, but it's a quiet place. I have a friend there, Anson. He's the blacksmith. A good man. He'd give me work, no questions asked." He was offering her a plan, a destination, a future. It was a fragile, uncertain thing, but it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "Willow Creek," she repeated the name, tasting it on her tongue. It sounded like a promise. "I'd like that." They shared the last of the dried beef from his saddlebags, a meager breakfast that felt like a feast, as they prepared to leave the small sanctuary that had changed both their lives. Clara felt a pang of reluctance, but looking at Luke's resolute face, she knew that their sanctuary was not a place, but each other. They saddled the horse, and as he lifted her up, his hands lingering at her waist. He looked her in the eye. "No more looking back," he said, a quiet command and a solemn vow. She nodded, and he swung up behind her, pulling her close as they rode out of the forest and into the clean, rain-washed light of a new day. The land was beautiful, alive with the fresh scent of wet earth and sagebrush. For the first time, Clara was not just looking at a landscape of endless work, but at a world of possibility. They rode in a comfortable silence, their bodies moving as one with the rhythm of the horse. The terror of the previous day felt a lifetime away, replaced by a quiet, steady hum of hope. It was near midday when the world shattered. They were crossing a wide, rocky wash when Luke suddenly reined in the horse, his body going tense behind her. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. "5 of them, coming fast." Clara's blood ran cold. The sheriff. They had been found, but as the riders grew closer, she saw they weren't wearing the badges of lawmen. They were rough-looking men in buckskins and worn denim, carrying rifles with a casual menace, and leading them, on a fine black stallion, was a man whose face she had hoped never to see again. Silas Croft. His face, usually florid and self-satisfied, was contorted into a mask of pure, vindictive rage. This was not a posse. This was a hunting party, and they were the prey. "There you are, my dear," Croft called out as his men fanned out, surrounding them. His voice was a greasy sneer. "Taking a little ride with the stable boy. Are we? I've come to escort you back. We have a contract to sign." "She's not going anywhere with you, Croft," Luke said, his voice dangerously calm. His arm tightened around Clara, a protective shield. Croft let out a wheezing laugh. "Is that so? This is none of your concern. Callahan, this is a business matter between me and the Miller family. I have paid a handsome price for this little filly, and I intend to collect what is mine." He looked at Clara, his eyes crawling over her in a way that made her skin feel filthy. "You have caused me a great deal of embarrassment, girl. But don't you worry. I'm a forgiving man. You'll have plenty of time to make it up to me." "You'll have to go through me first," Luke said, his hand moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the colt at his hip. "I was hoping you'd say that," Croft sneered, and gave a sharp nod to his men. It happened in a blur of violence. Luke was fast, his gun clearing the holster in a flash, but he was outnumbered 5-1. One of the hunters fired his rifle, not at Luke, but at his horse. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pain and terror, and collapsed, sending them both tumbling to the hard, rocky ground. Clara cried out as she hit the earth, the air knocked from her lungs. Luke was on his feet in an instant, pushing her behind him, his gun up and barking. One of the hunters cried out and clutched his arm, dropping his rifle, but the others were closing in. A big, bearded man swung the butt of his rifle, catching Luke squarely in the side of the head. Luke staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his lips, but he didn't go down. He turned, bringing his pistol around, but another man tackled him from the side, and they all fell upon him. A flurry of fists and boots. Clara screamed, scrambling to her feet, trying to get to him, but Croft grabbed her by the arm, his fleshy fingers digging into her like claws. "Watch, my dear," he panted, his breath hot and foul in her ear. "Watch how we deal with horse thieves who try to steal what is mine." It was a brutal, one-sided beating. Luke fought with a silent, desperate ferocity, but it was hopeless. The sickening thud of a boot hitting flesh, the grunts of the men, the dust rising around them. It was a nightmare. Finally, the bearded man who had struck him first raised his rifle butt again and brought it down with all his force on the back of Luke's head. There was a sickening crack, and Luke went limp, his body falling face down in the dust. "That's enough," Croft commanded, his voice filled with a smug satisfaction. He gave Luke's still form a contemptuous kick. "Let him rot. The coyotes will take care of the rest." He turned his attention back to Clara, who was struggling against his grip, her eyes wide with horror, a silent scream trapped in her throat. "Now, as for you..." It was in that moment that something inside Clara snapped. The terrified girl, who had flinched from every raised voice and angry glare, was gone, burned away in a fire of pure, unadulterated rage. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she twisted in his grip, brought her knee up hard into his groin, and sank her teeth into the fleshy hand that held her arm. Croft roared in pain and surprise. Letting her go, his men turned, stunned by the sudden turn of events. That was all the time she needed. She didn't run away. She ran toward Luke. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his still form, her heart a block of ice in her chest. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Luke, please." There was a gash on the back of his head, already matting his dark hair with blood. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. No, he was a shallow, ragged breath. He was alive. "Grab the girl," Croft wheezed, clutching himself. But as his men started toward her, Clara did the one thing they didn't expect. She reached for Luke's fallen gun. Her hand closed around the heavy, unfamiliar weight of the Colt. She didn't know how to shoot, but she cocked the hammer the way she'd seen Luke do, the click loud and final in the sudden silence, and pointed it at them, her small hands shaking but her eyes blazing with a deadly resolve. "Get away from him," she said, her voice low and shaking, but filled with a ferocity that made the men pause. "Get away, or I swear to God I will shoot you." They looked at her, then at Croft, who was still trying to catch his breath. They were paid hunters, not murderers. Beating a man was one thing. Getting shot by a wild-eyed girl over his body was another. The bearded man spat on the ground. "She ain't worth it, boss." Croft glared at Clara, his face a mask of hatred. "You will regret this, girl. You will crawl back, and when you do, you will beg me for mercy." He gestured to his men. "Let's go. They're as good as dead out here anyway." They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Clara alone in the vast, silent wash with the body of her unconscious protector and the dead horse. The moment they were gone, the adrenaline left her, and a wave of pure, paralyzing terror washed over her. But she couldn't afford to panic. Luke was alive. But for how long? She couldn't stay here in the open. She looked around desperately, her eyes scanning the rocky walls of the wash. There, a dark shadow under an overhang, half hidden by a thicket of scrub brush. A cave. Getting him there was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, a mountain of unresponsive muscle and bone. She tried to lift him, but could only manage to raise his shoulders. She sobbed in frustration, her tears mingling with the blood and dust on his face. She couldn't give up. She put her arms under his, locked her hands across his chest, and pulled. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the sharp rocks and coarse sand. Her muscles screamed, her back felt as if it would break, and the skin was scraped raw from her hands. But she didn't stop. With every step, she whispered his name, a mantra of desperation and love. It took her what felt like an eternity, but she finally got him into the shallow, dark cave. It was little more than a fissure in the rock, but it was shelter. She collapsed beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion, her lungs burning. For the next 3 days, the cave became her entire world. Her fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but it was overridden by a fierce, primal need to keep him alive. The girl who had been raised to be helpless and useless discovered a strength she never knew she had. She tore strips from her petticoat to clean and bandage the wound on his head as best she could. The first day, she stayed by his side, wiping his brow with a damp cloth she had soaked in a small puddle of rainwater, listening to every shallow, ragged breath, terrified he would stop. He was hot with fever, tossing and murmuring names she didn't know. On the second day, she knew she had to find water. She took the tin cup from his saddlebag and crept out of the cave. She found a series of small pools in the rocks where the rain had collected, and she painstakingly filled the cup, bringing it back to him, forcing a few precious drops between his cracked lips. Hunger began to gnaw at her, but she ignored it. His life was all that mattered. On the third day, his fever was worse. She knew he needed more than water. She remembered things from her childhood, walking the fields with her father. He had taught her which roots were safe to eat, which leaves could be boiled into a bitter tea to fight infection. She foraged near the cave, her eyes sharp, and managed to find a handful of gnarled roots. She built a tiny, smoky fire at the mouth of the cave, boiled the roots into a thin, murky broth, and patiently spooned the warm liquid into his mouth. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his eyes sometimes flickering open, unfocused and confused. She would talk to him, her voice low and soothing, telling him stories of the seas she had never seen, telling him about Willow Creek, painting a picture of the future that was keeping her alive. Late on the third night, as she sat huddled by the fire, watching him sleep, his eyes opened. This time, they were clear. He looked at her, then at the cave, then at the bandage on his head. He understood. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. Tears of relief streamed down her face. "Luke, you're awake." He tried to sit up, but groaned and fell back. He looked at her torn dress, her scraped hands, the exhaustion etched onto her face. He saw the fire, the cup with the dregs of broth. He saw everything she had done. "You saved me," he breathed, his voice filled with a raw, wondering awe. She just shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. He reached out, his hand weak, and took hers. His grip was faint, but it was there. "If I live through this, Clara," he said, his voice gaining a thread of its old strength, a fierce conviction that cut through his pain. "When we get to Willow Creek, I will marry you. I'll marry you in a church or under the open sky. Wherever you want, I'll build you a house where the sun rises, and no one will ever call you a foul name again. I promise you." His promise was not one of wealth or ease. It was a promise of dignity, of respect, of a life where she would finally be valued. It was everything she had never known she wanted. She leaned over, her tears falling onto his face, and pressed her forehead against his. "Luke," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it felt as if her heart would burst. "Being here, fighting for you, for us, for the first time in my whole life, I feel like I am truly a woman." The journey to Willow Creek was a slow, arduous pilgrimage. Luke was still weak, his movements stiff and pained, and they had to make frequent stops for him to rest. But for Clara, every mile that separated them from their past was a mile closer to a life she had never dared to imagine. She was no longer a passenger being rescued, but a partner in their survival. She foraged for edible plants, kept their small fire going at night, and tended to his wounds with a quiet, competent focus. In the shared hardship of the trail, a new intimacy grew between them, a bond forged not just in passion, but in the crucible of mutual dependence and unwavering trust. They saw the town from a low rise, nestled in a valley where a creek, lined with willows, snaked through a meadow of green. It wasn't much, a single dusty street, a handful of clapboard buildings, a church steeple, but after the barren plains and the dark memory of her past, it looked like the promised land. As they rode down the main street, Clara felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, bracing herself for the inevitable stares and whispers. But the people of Willow Creek were different. A man tipping his hat from the steps of the general store, a woman smiling at them from a porch swing, a group of children who waved as they passed. There was a simple, unadorned friendliness in the air, a sense of a community too busy with the work of living to waste time on malicious gossip. Luke led them to the blacksmith's forge at the end of the street. The air rang with the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. A mountain of a man with a wild red beard and arms like tree trunks emerged from the fiery glow, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather apron. His face broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin when he saw Luke. "Luke Callahan! By God, I thought you were a ghost!" the man boomed, clapping Luke on the back with a force that made him wince. "It's been too long. You son of a gun. Where have you been hiding yourself?" "Here and there, Anson," Luke said, a rare, small smile touching his own lips. "This is Clara. We're looking for a fresh start." Anson's bright blue eyes took in Clara's worn dress, the exhaustion on her face, and the way Luke stood protectively by her side. He saw the whole story in a single glance, but his expression held nothing but a gruff kindness. "Well, you've come to the right place," he said. "The livery stable needs a steady hand, and my wife Martha, the good Martha," he added with a wink, "is always complaining she can't find reliable help at the diner. You two look like hard workers. This town's got a place for hard workers." And just like that, they had a life. It was a life built from the ground up, one day at a time. Luke proved to be a natural with horses, his quiet, patient demeanor earning him the respect of the stable owner. Clara, who had only ever cooked under the critical eye of her stepmother, blossomed under the tutelage of Anson's wife. The good Martha was a bustling, no-nonsense woman with a heart as warm as the stove she commanded. She saw the fear in Clara's eyes on that first day and simply handed her an apron. "The first rule of my kitchen, child," she said, "is that we feed people, body and soul. The second is we don't abide cruelty. Now, let's see if you can peel a potato without taking half of it with the skin." Clara worked harder than she ever had in her life, but for the first time, her labor was rewarded not with blows and insults, but with a fair wage and a kind word. She learned the rhythms of the diner, the satisfaction of a busy lunch rush, the simple pleasure of a customer's compliment on her apple pie. At the end of each long day, she would walk to the stable to meet Luke, and they would walk back to the small, clean room they rented above the general store, their hands clasped together, their shoulders sometimes brushing. These small, ordinary moments were a treasure more precious than any gold. Of course, the whispers eventually followed them. A traveling salesman passing through recognized Luke's name. A family visiting from a neighboring county had heard the salacious tale of Silas Croft's runaway bride. The story arrived in pieces, a patchwork of rumor and speculation. But in Willow Creek, the seeds of gossip fell on barren ground. The people here had already taken the measure of the quiet cowboy who was so gentle with their horses, and the shy girl who served them their morning coffee with a sweet, tentative smile. They were good people. They worked hard. They were kind to children and animals. What they had done before they arrived was their own business. Here, a person's worth was judged not by their past, but by their present character, in a world that had always sought to define them by their shame. Willow Creek offered them the priceless gift of a blank slate. One evening, a few months after their arrival, Clara was wiping down the last of the tables in the diner. It was late, and the room was quiet save for the crackle of the fire in the wood stove. Luke came in, as he always did, the scent of hay and horses clinging to him. But tonight, he seemed different. There was a nervous energy about him, a tension in the set of his shoulders. "You ready to go?" Clara asked, smiling. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there in the doorway, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "Clara," he began, his voice a little rough, "we've got a life here. It's not much. A rented room, a few dollars at the end of the week. It's not the house with the sunrise I promised you, not yet. It's more than I ever dreamed of." "Luke," she said softly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. He walked toward her, stopping just in front of her table. "It's not enough," he said. "It's not everything you deserve, but I want to give you what I can. All of it." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Clara." I think I have from the moment I saw you by that creek, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be a man who is worthy of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He knelt, right there on the worn floorboards of the empty diner, and held it out to her. It wasn't a ring of gold or silver. It was a simple, narrow band of braided leather, dark and supple, something he had clearly made himself. It was a piece of his world, strong, humble, and crafted with patient, loving hands. "Clara Miller," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Clara's face, not of sorrow or pain, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like a flood. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, again and again, and then she was kneeling on the floor with him, her arms wrapped around his neck, her answer a kiss that held all the promise of their future. Their wedding was a simple affair, held on a bright, crisp autumn morning in the town's small wooden church. The preacher spoke of love and resilience, his words echoing in the sun-drenched room. Anson stood beside Luke as his best man, and Martha, the good Martha, stood with Clara, her broad, smiling face beaming with pride. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out to wish them well, their face a sea of warmth and acceptance. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had bought with her own wages, and in her hair, she had woven a sprig of willow from the banks of the creek. As Luke slid the braided leather ring onto her finger, she felt not like a runaway or an outcast, but like a bride, cherished and beloved. The peace lasted for 2 wonderful months. They were the happiest of Clara's life. Then, one day, the past rode into town. It was a busy afternoon at the diner. Clara was clearing plates, laughing at a joke Anson had told her, when the door swung open, casting a long shadow into the room. A chill went down her spine before she even saw who it was. She looked up, and her blood ran cold. It was her stepmother, Martha Miller. She was dressed in her severe black mourning clothes, her face a mask of righteous fury, and beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, was the sheriff from their old town, a hard-faced man with cold, unforgiving eyes. The cheerful chatter in the diner died away. Every eye turned to the newcomers. "There she is, Sheriff," Martha announced, her voice a clarion call of accusation, pointing a bony finger at Clara. "There's the thief." Clara stood frozen, a stack of dirty plates held in her trembling hands. The room began to spin. "Clara Miller," the sheriff said, his voice a flat, official drone. "I have a warrant for your arrest. You are accused by your legal guardian, Mrs. Martha Miller, of the theft of valuable family property, including jewelry, silverware, and a significant sum of cash, taken on the night you absconded from your home." A collective gasp went through the diner. Anson's wife stepped forward, her hands on her hips. "Now you hold on just a minute. There must be some mistake. This is Clara Callahan. She's a good girl, works hard. She wouldn't steal a thing." "That's what she'd have you believe," Martha sneered, her eyes glittering with malice as she looked at Clara. "She is a deceitful, ungrateful creature, just like her mother. She ran off with that gallows bird husband of hers and took everything of value that wasn't nailed down." The plate slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor and shattering into 100 pieces. The sound broke the spell. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the friendly faces now clouded with confusion and suspicion. The old shame, the old terror, came flooding back, threatening to drown her. "That's a lie." The voice came from the doorway. It was Luke. He had just come from the stable, and he stood there, tall and unmoving, his face a granite mask of cold, controlled fury. He walked into the room, his eyes never leaving Martha, and came to stand beside Clara, taking her trembling hand in his. He didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at the shocked faces of his friends. He looked directly at the woman who had tormented them both. "You've said your piece, Martha," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Now I'll say mine." He turned to face the sheriff and the entire town. He squeezed Clara's hand, a silent message of strength. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was as clear and solid as a blacksmith's anvil, "has never stolen a single thing in her life." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had become their community. "She has known nothing but hardship and cruelty, and she has met it with a grace you could never understand." He turned his burning gaze back to Martha. "She stole nothing of yours. She walked away with nothing but the thin dress on her back and a heart full of bruises you put there." Then he looked at the sheriff, at the town, at the whole world, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "The only thing she ever stole," he declared, his voice thick with a love that was fierce and absolute, "was my heart." Luke's declaration hung in the stunned silence of the diner, as potent and final as a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. The sheriff from their old town looked from Luke's unwavering face to Martha's sputtering rage, then to the faces of the Willow Creek townsfolk, who were now looking at Clara not with suspicion, but with a fierce, protective loyalty. He was a lawman in a town that was not his, facing a community that had clearly already passed its own judgment. "A touching sentiment, Callahan," the sheriff said, his voice laced with weary cynicism. "But I have a warrant. This is a legal matter. It will be settled by a judge, not by pretty words in a cafe." He gestured to Clara. "Ma'am, you'll have to come with me." "She will not!" Anson, the blacksmith, boomed from the crowd. Taking a step forward, his wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression formidable. "This is our town. Sheriff, we have our own justice of the peace. If there are accusations to be made, they will be heard here, in the light of day, where we all know the character of the accused." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The sheriff, seeing he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, gave a curt, frustrated nod. "Fine," he conceded. "We'll do it your way. But the law is the law. A warrant is a warrant." The hearing was convened in the town hall, a simple, wood-paneled room that served as a courtroom, church and meeting place. Judge Abernathy, a stern-looking man with a tidy white beard and spectacles perched on his nose, presided from a heavy oak desk. The room was packed. The entire town squeezed onto the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Clara and Luke sat at a small table on one side, Martha and her sheriff on the other. Martha was called to speak first. She played the part of the grieving, wronged widow to perfection. She wept as she described how she had taken Clara in, a poor, motherless child, and given her a home. She painted a picture of Clara as a sullen, ungrateful, and deceitful girl. With a trembling hand, she produced a list of the items Clara had allegedly stolen: her own dear mother's silver locket, a set of pearl earrings, the family's silver cutlery, and, most damningly, a small lockbox containing over $200 in cash, the farm's emergency savings. "She took everything," Martha sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a black-bordered handkerchief. "She stripped the house of its most precious memories and its security, all to run off with this man, the son of a known murderer. She has brought nothing but shame and ruin upon us." It was a masterful performance. Clara shrank in her chair, the weight of the lies pressing down on her, the familiar feeling of worthlessness creeping back in. She felt the eyes of the town on her and imagined their doubt, their pity turning to scorn. But then she felt Luke's hand cover hers under the table, his grip firm and steady, a silent anchor in the storm. When it was Luke's turn to speak, he did not rise. He sat beside Clara, his hand still holding hers, and looked directly at Judge Abernathy. "Judge," he began, his voice calm and clear, "I can't speak to any lockbox or jewelry. I can only speak to the character of my wife. I have seen her work until her hands were raw without a word of complaint. I have seen her show kindness to a wounded animal when she had none for herself. And I have seen her endure a kind of cruelty that would break most people, and she has never, not once, met it with anything but a quiet dignity. He turned his gaze to Martha. As for the night we left, I can tell you what she had with her. She had the dress she was wearing, which was threadbare and patched. She had a thin shawl, and she had a purple scarf I had given her. That was all. There was no jewelry, no silverware, and certainly no $200. "He's lying to protect her!" Martha shrieked. "It is your word against hers, Mr. Callahan," the judge said, his expression unreadable. "A compelling testament to character, but not a refutation of the evidence presented. The list is quite specific." "The list is a fiction," Luke said calmly, "and I have something that will prove it." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed document, tied with a faded ribbon. He stood, walked to the judge's desk, and laid it before him. "What is this?" the judge asked, peering at it over his spectacles. "That," Luke said, his voice ringing with a quiet triumph, "is the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Miller, Clara's father. I believe you will find it illuminating." A shocked silence fell over the room. Martha's face went white, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure terror. The judge carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the brittle paper. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. The only sound in the room was the rustle of the old document. "Where did you get this?" the judge asked, his eyes sharp as he looked up at Luke. "In an old hunter's cabin, deep in the woods on the edge of the Miller property. It was in a rusted lockbox, tucked under a loose floorboard. We took shelter there the night we fled. I found it then." Luke looked at Clara, a memory passing between them of that first, desperate night of freedom. "I didn't know what it was at first, not until we reached Willow Creek and I had the light to read it properly. It seems Mr. Miller didn't fully trust his new wife's intentions." The judge nodded slowly, then cleared his throat. He looked out at the packed room. "This document," he announced, his voice carrying a new weight of authority, "is dated 1 month before the death of Thomas Miller. It is signed by him and witnessed by 2 of his neighbors at the time, men whose signatures are on record in the county seat. It appears to be entirely legal and binding." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "In this will, Mr. Miller bequeaths a small sum to his wife, Martha Miller, for her care. He leaves his personal effects to his step-siblings, Abigail and Thomas, and the farm, the entire property, the house, the livestock, and all its holdings. He leaves, solely and entirely, to his beloved daughter, Clara." A collective gasp went through the room. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a stunning, world-altering revelation. It was hers, the place of her torment, the source of her pain. It had been hers all along. "That's a forgery!" Martha screeched, lunging to her feet. "A lie! The man is a criminal! He created that!" "Ma'am," the judge said, his voice now as cold as a winter wind, "I have in my possession the property deed you filed after your husband's death, claiming the farm as your own, a deed which, you claimed, was supported by his final will, a will which no one but you ever saw. The signature on this document here," he tapped the will, "is a perfect match for every other known signature of Thomas Miller. The signature on your deed, however, now appears to be a rather clumsy imitation. The trap had been sprung. The hunter was now the hunted." Martha stared at the will as if it were a snake, her face crumbling from righteous fury into the sallow, pinched mask of a cornered thief. You have no proof," she stammered, but her voice lacked all conviction. "I believe we do," the judge said grimly. He looked at the sheriff from the other town. "Sheriff, it seems the crime here was not committed by Mrs. Callahan, but against her, Forgery of a legal document and the fraudulent seizure of property are serious offenses in this territory. The sheriff looked at Martha, his face a mixture of disgust and professional obligation. He had come to arrest a runaway girl and had instead stumbled upon a cold-hearted swindler. Martha Miller, who had just moments before been the picture of wronged virtue, was now exposed, her greed and cruelty laid bare for the entire world to see. The news traveled back to their old town on the telegraph wire, faster than a horse could gallop. The story of the trial, of the will, of Martha's treachery, became the only topic of conversation. The people who had whispered about Clara's mother, who had called Luke gallows trash, who had watched in silent complicity as Martha abused her stepdaughter, were now forced to confront the ugly truth. They had not been discerning judges of character. They had been fools, and worse, they had been cruel. When Clara's name was mentioned now, it was with a hushed, shameful respect. A week later, Luke and Clara rode back. They did not return for revenge, but for reclamation, as they rode down the main street of the town that had scorned them. The silence was deafening. People stopped what they were doing and simply stared. Mrs. Gable, standing on the steps of the general store, turned her face away, her cheeks burning with shame. Abigail and Thomas watched from the porch of their house, their faces pale and slack-jawed, the foundation of their smug superiority shattered. Clara sat tall in the saddle of a new horse Luke had bought her, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward. She no longer saw a gauntlet of judgment. She saw a street of ghosts, people whose opinions were now as meaningless as dust in the wind. Luke rode beside her, his expression calm and proud, his hand resting near hers on the saddle horn. They were not angry. They had won, and their victory was so complete that it required no gloating, no words at all. Their quiet, unassailable dignity was its own powerful statement. They arrived at the farm as the sun was setting, bathing the familiar fields and the old farmhouse in a blaze of crimson and gold. It looked different now. Not a prison, but a kingdom. Their kingdom. They dismounted and walked, hand in hand, to the porch. The house was empty. Martha and her children had packed their things and fled in the night, disappearing before the law could catch up with them. They stood there for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. The sky was awash in the soft colors of a new beginning. Luke turned to Clara, his stormy eyes gentle in the fading light. He reached out and touched the braided leather ring on her finger. "I promised you a house where the sun rises, Mrs. Callahan," he said softly. "It seems you had one all along." She smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the land that was now rightfully hers, her home. He wrapped his arm around her, and she covered his hand with her own, their fingers lacing together. Two outcasts, two souls who had been discarded by the world, stood together as the first stars began to appear in the velvet sky. They had faced down the liars, the gossips, and the thieves. They had fought for their lives and for their love. And here, in the quiet twilight, holding hands on the porch of their own home, they were the living, breathing proof that even in the harshest wilderness, justice could take root, and love could be the one thing that truly sets you free. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories like this one. And don't forget to share your thoughts. We read every one.